Hello, my name is Fana Tamra, and in this presentation, I'll be discussing the Bay of Pigs invasion and its aftermath, which took place from April 1961 through October 1962. This case study is critical for understanding how intelligence failures, poor interagency coordination, and Cold War pressure shaped one of the most embarrassing U.S. foreign policy moments, and how the National Security Council responded. This event directly influenced future U.S. decisions, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis. To set the scene, the Bay of Pigs was a covert U.S.-backed operation to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro, who had recently aligned himself with the Soviet Union. For context, Castro and his guerrilla army had overthrown the Cuban government a few years earlier in January 1959, declaring himself prime minister and taking control of the country. The CIA trained Cuban exiles who left Cuba once Castro became leader for an invasion through the water, believing that once the attack began, anti-Castro Cubans would rise up. The invasion occurred on April 17, 1961, but the plan failed miserably. Castro's forces crushed the invasion in just 3 days. The operation was carried out along Cuba's southern coast at a place called the Bay of Pigs. The U.S. supported this effort mainly to stop the spread of communism so close to home and to remove a potential Soviet ally in the Western Hemisphere. So what exactly went wrong? The core issue was the flawed assumption that the operation could succeed without U.S. military intervention and that the Cuban people would rise up to support the uprising. The CIA underestimated Castro's military preparedness and overestimated internal Cuban support for Castro. So what? Well, the failed invasion severely damaged U.S. credibility on the global stage and emboldened both Cuba and the Soviet Union to strengthen ties with one another. As a result, the NSC and White House had to rethink their entire approach to covert operations and intelligence assessments. This failure led directly to better-informed planning processes, and less than 2 years later, we saw those improvements in how the Cuban Missile Crisis was managed. President Kennedy initially approved the operation under the assumption that it would be successful and limited. However, he was reluctant to commit open U.S. forces, which ultimately contributed to its failure. The CIA led the planning and execution with minimal strategic oversight from the NSC. The State and Defense departments were largely sidelined, and intelligence assessments were overly optimistic. The lack of interagency coordination and realism revealed major gaps in how the national security decisions were made. After the failure, Kennedy demanded reforms in the NSC structure, insisting on better collaboration, skeptical analysis, and open communications between agencies. To think critically about the invasion, I used a SWOT analysis. There were some strengths: political unity against communism, the rapid organization of exile forces, and initial secrecy. However, the weaknesses were clear: poor planning, bad assumptions, lack of air support, and no clear backup plan. On the bright side, the failure gave the NSC a real chance to reform its operations. It exposed the need for better alliance building and more thoughtful planning. But threats remained. The failed invasion worsened U.S.-Latin American relations, damaged global credibility, and damaged President John F. Kennedy's credibility, and set the stage for increased Soviet activity in Cuba, which eventually brought us to the brink of nuclear war. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a critical national security failure, but also served as a turning point. Kennedy and his advisors realized that decision-making had to involve more than just a single agency like the CIA. He revamped the NSC's procedures, emphasized better planning, and fostered collaboration between intelligence, military, and diplomatic leaders. These lessons were also applied in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we saw far more strategic discipline. In retrospect, while the invasion was a failure, it forced the U.S. to take national security policy and planning more seriously. For this project, I relied on a range of credible sources, most being reports from educational institutions, directly from the State Department, and archives from JFK Library and the National Security Archive. These gave me a well-rounded understanding of the invasion and its aftermath. I'm confident in my sources' credibility, and I did my best to pick reliable sources. This case study helped me see how intelligence, leadership, and policy all intersect, and how a single failure can lead to long-term institutional change. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope you liked it.